You found it. Your home for the best content on your favorite team, the Fighting Tigers of LSU. Do us a favor. Subscribe to the channel. Leave your comments below. Be sure to smash that like button. That has been a giant talking point here is what is Brian Kelly going to do with his staff? And a lot of people have wondered about the OC and DC hires, which have been slow. I want to be very clear. At this point, it really doesn't matter. Timing, let me be clear. The timing doesn't matter. The reason to rush would have been to get your coordinators in place before the early signing period. Now that the early signing period is passed, recruiting is in a dead period until January. So there's no point really in rushing to make a hire now. So we've speculated, and many have, that maybe who Brian Kelly is targeting is a coordinator that's still coaching in the playoffs or maybe in the NFL. And if that's the case, well, then there's no reason really to rush. Just wait until their seasons are over and then hire them, because the February signing date is even after the Super Bowl. So you can get your coordinator in place and have plenty of time still to recruit and tell your prospects who the coordinator is going to be by the time the February signing period comes around. So really, timing only mattered before the early signing period. Now that that's passed, it doesn't really matter. There's no rush anymore to get a coordinator in place. That said, over the weekend, Football Scoop, it was John Bryce at Football Scoop who had a report that Brian Kelly apparently is narrowing down his search for OC and DC. And looks like Mike Denbrock, who is currently the OC at Cincinnati, is who they're targeting on the offensive side. And Matt House, who's a member of the Kansas City Chiefs coaching staff, is who they're targeting on the defensive side. So let's delve into each of these a little bit and start with Mike Denbrock on the offensive side. There's a lot of history with Mike Denbrock and Brian Kelly. So Denbrock was on Brian Kelly's staff for 7 seasons at Notre Dame. He was his OC for 7 years at Notre Dame. Denbrock also had been with Brian Kelly when he was at Division II Grand Valley State early in their careers. Remember, that's where Kelly started. He was at Grand Valley State, then he went to Central Michigan, then to Cincinnati, and then to Notre Dame, now to LSU. So Denbrock has a long history with Brian Kelly. And they've had some success. When Denbrock was at Notre Dame from 2010 to 2016, he coached tight ends, he coached receivers, he was the passing game coordinator, was the OC, coached wide receivers in 2014, he was associate head coach, he was wide receivers coach. He held a lot of different roles within Brian Kelly's staff, and was actually the OC on that team when they went to the 2012 BCS National Championship game that lost in that game to Alabama. So Denbrock and Brian Kelly have a long history together, and here recently, Denbrock, of course, has been the OC at Cincinnati, where he's coached Desmond Ridder and that Cincinnati offense, which has been somewhat high-flying, and they're in the college football playoff right now. The one thing I would tell you that's a little bit of an outlier here with Denbrock is he's 57 years old. And I'm not sitting here trying to say one way or another that you should hire someone young or old. That's not the point. I mean, Steve Ensminger was the offensive coordinator of the greatest offensive team we've ever seen before. But something that we have seen with Brian Kelly is a little bit of a tendency, certainly on the defensive side, and then recently with Tommy Rees as OC, to go younger. And we have seen in major college football largely this era of these new offenses, these newfangled spread offenses, and going younger with more younger, innovative offensive minds around college football. That's certainly not the rule, so to speak. Alabama had a magnificent year. Bill O'Brien is their offensive coordinator. He's been around the game for a very long time. He's in his 50s. Mentioned Denbrock. I mean, they're in the college football playoff. Another person apparently that Brian Kelly talked to, according to Football Scoop, is Georgia offensive coordinator Todd Monken, who elected to stay at UGA. Can hardly say that to blame him. It would very much feel lateral going Georgia to LSU within the SEC when you're at a program that's playing for a national championship right now anyway, provided they're paying what we all expect and think that they should and will. So And you know a lot of the other names throughout college football who were the wunderkind, offensive minds and play callers. But if it's your Lincoln Rileys, or even you could look at a Josh Heupel at Tennessee or whatever. So that's one sort of outlier, is that you're going with someone more familiar as opposed to going younger, innovative offensive mind. But I trust Brian Kelly, which is an overarching point I'll get to further here in a second. The other coordinator hire that Football Scoop is reporting is Matt House. Now, Matt House is the linebackers coach for the Kansas City Chiefs. He's in his third season in that role. What's interesting about Matt House is that he basically spent 20 years in college football before jumping into the NFL with the Kansas City Chiefs. He actually started his coaching career, so he finished his undergrad at Michigan State in 2000, and then began his coaching career as a GA at Michigan State in 01-02. From there, he went to North Carolina. He went to Gardner-Webb. He went to the University of Buffalo, jumped into the NFL with the Panthers and the Rams, and then was back in the college game for some time. And he was with Pittsburgh from 2012 to 2014. He was with Miami. He was with Kentucky. And that's where he was before he jumped into the NFL. He was Mark Stoops' defensive coordinator at Kentucky for 3 seasons before jumping into the NFL as the linebackers coach with the Kansas City Chiefs. Now, the interesting twist there is that House is still very good friends with Brad White, who's the current Kentucky defensive coordinator, who Brian Kelly tried to hire. So, it's very clear Brian Kelly has a lot of respect for what Mark Stoops is doing defensively there in Lexington. If he tried to hire Brad White, and now he shifted to look at Matt House. And if they're able to pull this off with Matt House, it's even more interesting because just last year, Matt House turned down a couple of coordinator opportunities in the SEC, including Tennessee and Auburn. So you're talking about a guy that is clearly respected, has been sought after, was in the SEC as a DC, left for the NFL where he's been for 3 years as a position coach, was pursued last year by 2 SEC teams in Tennessee and Auburn, decided to stay in the NFL, but now apparently he's willing to come back to the college game at LSU. If that's maybe because it's LSU, because of whatever maybe they're offering to pay, the opportunity to work with Brian Kelly, I don't know. And if ultimately, again, these are big ifs, if they consummate these deals and get these coaches on staff, then and only then might you get answers to those questions. But again, when you look at House, you're talking about a guy that's in his mid-40s, which is a little bit of a deviation from what Brian Kelly had done at Notre Dame, where he had Bob Diaco, who's in his late 30s when he was hired. Diaco gets hired away to be the head coach at UConn. He brought in Brian Van Gorder, which was really the one outlier in his time at Notre Dame. Van Gorder was in his mid-50s. Kelly and Van Gorder had a long history together. Van Gorder was there for 6 years and had a lot of success, but ultimately they parted ways. They fired him mid-season in his final year there. And then they had that run of Mike Elko for a year, who, of course, got hired away by A&M. Clark Lee, who got hired to become the head coach at Vanderbilt. And then Marcus Freeman, most recently, who's now the head coach at Notre Dame. All were in their 30s when they were hired by Stoops. So, again, a little bit of a deviation where you're going with somewhat of an older coach, as opposed to, not to say that if you're in your mid-40s, you're old, but it's a deviation from what we had seen recently from Brian Kelly in South Bend. But the one point, the overarching point with all of this that I'd like to make is I just trust Brian Kelly because he has a proven history of making really good hires. I just ran through the DC names that, he had Denbrock there, who's doing phenomenal right now at Cincinnati. Even Tommy Rees as the offensive coordinator did a really masterful job calling plays and developing Ian Book and going through that offensive system there in South Bend. So it's a contrast to what LSU had with Ed Ogeron, whose strikeout rate was much higher. I mean, when you look at the coaches that Ed hired, and you all know the list, but if it's Matt Canada or Jerry Sullivan as a passing game coordinator or Scott Linehan as a passing game coordinator, if it was Bo Pelini or Peets and Mangus and Durante. I mean, you'll know the list. I mean, Ed's swing and miss rate was much higher, so he didn't deserve the benefit of the doubt. Brian Kelly does. I mean, he's just got a long history of hiring great coaches. So you're just like, okay, here, who do you want? You think this guy's good? Okay. And if it works out, he'll live with it. He'll live with the result. If it doesn't, he'll have to live with the result of that as well. So that's kind of where I am. In a similar mindset of when Scott Woodward was making this hire. Woodward has the reputation and the long track record of identifying and making big hires, so just trusted he was going to find the right guy, and he did. I'd say I'm in the same mind frame right here with Brian Kelly with these coordinator hires to say, look, if he's done his due diligence and done interviews and vetted these guys, and this is where he landed, and he wants Denbrock in-house, okay. I mean, he's got a great track record. I trust him to know. I don't know a ton about these guys, but if he does, and you trust your head coach to go identify and make good coaching hires, I'm good with it. So it looks like that's what it'll be. We thought, though, according to Football Scoop, that Brad White was in the mix and ultimately decided to stay in Lexington. So they still got a ways to go before they actually get these deals finalized, and it's very likely, again, that Denbrock's going to stay with Cincinnati through the playoff, and Matt House is going to stay in Kansas City through the Chiefs season, which, if it's anything like the last 2 years, is going to go into February in the Super Bowl. But it may be a while before those guys, maybe another month or so before those guys are in place in Baton Rouge. But at least you seem to have a pretty clear idea of the direction Brian Kelly's going as he tries to finish out this coaching staff, his first in Baton Rouge. And there's still a lot of other turnover happening. We saw this weekend Blake Baker won't be back, and there's been a lot of support staff personnel let go as well. Kind of speaks to what we've talked about. You're going to pay Brian Kelly $100 million. You got to let him. It's the Bill Parcells line. You're gonna if you're going to be cooking the dinner, you got to be able to shop for the groceries. If Brian Kelly's making $100 million and he's going to live with the results, he's going to be judged upon the results. You have to let him build this program how he wants to do it, and clearly he's doing that. So looks like LSU zeroing in on its coordinator hires, but not likely to be in place until after their respective seasons are done. Hey, thanks so much for watching. Please leave your comments. I love to interact, and be sure to hit the red subscribe button below.